The terror from the void, the morning light, filtered through the crystalline walls of the Galactic Academy as students from across the known universe gathered in Lecture Hall Omega 7. The massive amphitheater buzzed with nervous energy as beings of every conceivable shape and form settled into their specialized seating arrangements. Floating gas clouds drifted near the ceiling while crystalline entities perched on specially designed platforms. Multi-limbed creatures from the outer rim systems adjusted their environmental suits, and aquatic beings observed from sealed observation tanks. Professor Kethera stood at the front of the hall, her four arms gracefully manipulating the holographic controls. Her species, the Viridians, were known throughout the galaxy for their expertise in xenobiology and their particular talent for cataloging the most dangerous creatures in space. Her emerald skin gleamed under the artificial lighting, and her three eyes surveyed the assembled students with the confidence of someone who had spent decades studying the galaxy's most terrifying predators. Today's lesson would be different from their usual discussions of peaceful herbivores or simple aquatic life forms. Today, they would examine something that gave nightmares to entire star systems. The attendance was unusually high. Word had spread through the Academy that Professor Kethera would be presenting footage of the legendary Shadow Maw, a creature so feared that most civilizations had entire military divisions dedicated solely to avoiding the regions where they were known to exist. Xylith, a young crystalline from the Andorian system, vibrated nervously in their mineral-based seat. Their translucent body pulsed with anxious energy as they communicated telepathically with their study partner, Noxus, a gas-form entity whose consciousness floated in a shimmering cloud of purple vapor. Both had heard stories about the Shadow Maw since they were younglings, tales whispered in the dark that made even the bravest warriors reconsider their career choices. The Hive Queen Thessera represented her entire collective consciousness in this lecture. Her insectoid form dominated several seats as her compound eyes reflected the holographic displays around the room. Even her species, known for their fearlessness in battle, maintained a respectful distance from Shadow Maw territory. The collective memory of her hive held records of entire colonies that had simply vanished when these creatures appeared in their systems. From the aquatic section, Ambassador Tidal's whale-like form moved restlessly in his massive tank. His sonar-based communication system clicked and whistled with nervous frequency. The oceanic civilizations had legends of shadow maws that lived in the deepest trenches of space, hunting entire fleets of ships as if they were schools of fish. Professor Kethera raised one of her arms for attention, and the hall gradually fell silent. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had documented creatures that had destroyed entire worlds. Today, we examine something unprecedented in our xenobiological studies, she announced, her three eyes scanning the diverse audience. A creature so perfectly designed for destruction that our classification systems required the creation of an entirely new threat category. The lights dimmed, and suddenly the entire hall was filled with an oppressive darkness that seemed to absorb light itself. Then, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare-given form, the holographic projection of a shadow maw materialized before them. The collective gasp from the students created a small atmospheric disturbance as environmental systems struggled to cope with the sudden change in air pressure. The creature was massive, easily the size of a small starship. Its body seemed to be made of living darkness, shifting and flowing like liquid shadow. 6 limbs ended in claws that could rend through starship hulls as easily as paper. Its head was a horror of evolutionary perfection, featuring rows of teeth that gleamed like obsidian daggers and eyes that burned with an intelligence that spoke of calculated malevolence. Most terrifying of all were the tendrils that extended from its back, each one capable of independent movement and thought, allowing it to hunt multiple prey simultaneously. Xylith's crystalline form dimmed with terror, while Noxus's gaseous body contracted into the smallest possible space. Thessara's entire hive mind recoiled, and Ambassador Tidal dove to the bottom of his tank, instinctively seeking the safety of depth. The Shadow Maw, Professor Kethera continued, though her voice carried less confidence than usual, represents the apex of predatory evolution. They hunt in the void between stars, capable of surviving in the vacuum of space for centuries without food. When they do feed, they consume not just organic matter, but energy itself. Entire star systems have gone dark after Shadow Maw encounters. The hologram shifted to show the creature in motion, demonstrating its terrifying grace as it moved through space. Its limbs could extend to incredible lengths, allowing it to snare prey from distances that made escape impossible. The tendrils showed independent intelligence, coordinating attacks with a precision that suggested not just animal cunning, but strategic thinking. They are solitary hunters, the professor explained, but when prey is abundant, they have been known to work in pairs. No military force in the known galaxy has successfully engaged a Shadow Maw and survived to report accurate tactical data. They are quite simply the perfect killing machine. The display showed grainy footage from a military encounter, one of the few recordings that had survived a Shadow Maw attack. The images were fragmentary and chaotic, showing massive claws tearing through starship armor as if it were cloth. The sound recordings captured the last transmissions of brave soldiers who faced something beyond their worst nightmares. Their hunting method is particularly disturbing, Professor Kethra continued, calling up tactical analyses. They target the largest, most powerful ships first, eliminating command structures and leaving smaller vessels isolated and helpless. They seem to take pleasure in the hunt, often toying with their prey before delivering the killing blow. The assembled students were transfixed with horror. Many had covered their optical organs or retreated as far as possible into their protective shells or environmental suits. The lecture hall had become a gallery of terror, as beings from across the galaxy confronted their shared nightmare. That was when the doors burst open with a loud clang that made everyone jump. Jake Williams stumbled into the lecture hall, balancing a cup of coffee, a backpack that seemed to contain his entire worldly possessions, and what appeared to be a breakfast sandwich. His brown hair was messy from sleep, and he wore the kind of casual clothes that suggested he had never met a dress code he couldn't ignore. "Sorry, I'm late, Professor," Jake called out cheerfully, his voice cutting through the atmosphere of dread like a knife through butter. "The gravity simulator in my dorm went haywire again, and I got stuck on the ceiling for like 20 minutes. Every eye, sensor, and optical organ in the room turned to stare at the human as he made his way down the stairs, somehow managing to trip over his own feet and knock over Xylitha's water container in the process. He seemed completely oblivious to the massive holographic nightmare that dominated the center of the room. Jake settled into a seat, took a sip of his coffee, and looked up at the Shadow Maw projection with mild interest. "Oh cool, what's this guy? Some kind of space octopus?" The silence that followed was so complete that even the environmental systems seemed to hold their breath. Professor Kethera's 3 eyes blinked in sequence as she tried to process what she had just heard. A human had just looked at the galaxy's most feared predator and compared it to a harmless Earthsea creature. "Mr. Williams," she said carefully, "this is a Shadow Maw. It is classified as the most dangerous predator in known space." Jake squinted at the hologram, tilting his head like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Huh, yeah, I can see why that might be scary. Those claws are pretty impressive." He took another sip of coffee. "Though the proportions seem a bit off for optimal swimming. Are these guys aquatic or more of a void-based life form?" The casual scientific curiosity in his voice sent ripples of shock through the assembled students. Noxus's gaseous form flickered with confusion, while Thessara's compound eyes reflected a kind of existential crisis. This human was discussing the Shadow Maw like it was a specimen in a biology textbook rather than a cosmic horror. "Void-based," Professor Kethra managed to say, her voice slightly strained. "They hunt in the empty spaces between star systems." That makes more sense," Jake nodded, pulling out his tablet to take notes. The limb extensions would be for maintaining contact with prey in zero-gravity environments. Pretty clever evolutionary adaptation. What's their primary food source? The professor stared at him. They consume everything, Mr. Williams. Organic matter, energy, sometimes entire crews of starships. Jake's eyebrows went up with interest. Everything? That's unusual. Most predators specialize. There must be some pretty intense selective pressure in their environment to produce such a generalized feeding strategy. He gestured at the hologram with his coffee cup. Has anyone done metabolic studies on them? I'd be curious to know how they process such diverse energy sources. Ambassador Tidal surfaced in his tank, his whale-song voice carrying disbelief. You speak of this creature as if it were a research subject rather than an apex predator capable of destroying worlds. Well, yeah, Jake said, looking confused by the question. I mean, it's definitely dangerous, but that just makes it more interesting from a biological perspective. Look at those neural tendrils. Each one appears to have independent processing capability, which suggests a distributed nervous system. That's incredibly sophisticated. Xylitha's crystalline form pulsed with what could only be described as horror. Mr. Williams, this creature has destroyed entire fleets. It is death incarnate. Jake considered this for a moment, then shrugged. So, our hurricanes, but we still study those. Understanding how something works is the first step to dealing with it effectively. He gestured at the tactical display. These military encounters all seem to follow the same pattern. Large ships engaged first, smaller vessels isolated. Classic pack hunting behavior, even though you said they're solitary. Pack hunting? Professor Kethera's voice cracked slightly. Sure, lions do the same thing on Earth. Target the biggest threat first, scatter the herd, then pick off the stragglers. It's a proven strategy. Jake looked around at the terrified faces surrounding him. Though, I guess most of your species didn't evolve alongside large predators, so this kind of behavior would seem pretty alien to you. The implication of his words sank in slowly. This human was not just unafraid of the shadow maw. He was analyzing it with the casual confidence of someone who understood predatory behavior from personal experience. The assembled aliens began to realize that perhaps the most dangerous creature in the room was not the one in the holographic display. Professor Kethera found her voice. Mr. Williams, you speak as if you have experience with creatures of this caliber. Jake laughed, a sound that somehow made the Shadow Maw hologram seem less menacing by comparison. Not space creatures, obviously, but Earth has its fair share of apex predators. Bears, big cats, sharks, wolves. You learn to coexist with dangerous animals when you share a planet with them. Coexist. Thessara's hive-mind voice carried the collective bewilderment of her entire species. You coexist with apex predators? Sure, it's all about understanding their behavior and respecting their capabilities. Most predators don't want to waste energy on prey that's going to be difficult to catch. If you know what you're doing, you can usually avoid conflicts. Jake gestured at the Shadow Maw again. This guy probably operates on similar principles. Big, scary, efficient, but also energy conscious. I bet there are ways to make yourself less attractive as a target. The lecture hall buzzed with whispered conversations as students tried to process this information. The human was not just unafraid of their shared nightmare. He was treating it like a problem to be solved rather than a force to be fled from. Mr. Williams, Professor Kethera said slowly, are you suggesting the humans could potentially survive an encounter with a Shadow Maw? Jake scratched his head, which the aliens had learned was his gesture for thinking, survive? Maybe. It would depend on the circumstances. But honestly, I'd rather study one from a safe distance first. Understanding the behavioral patterns would be key to any survival strategy. As the implications of this statement settled over the room, the assembled students began to look at Jake with a mixture of awe and terror. They had come to learn about the galaxy's most feared predator, only to discover that they had been sharing lecture halls with something potentially even more dangerous. And the most terrifying part was that the humans seemed to consider this perfectly normal. The hunter becomes the studied the lecture hall remained silent for several long moments as the assembled aliens processed what they had just heard. Their shared nightmare, the creature that entire civilizations fled from, had just been casually analyzed by a human who seemed more interested in its hunting efficiency than its capacity for destruction. Professor Kethera decided to test the boundaries of Jake's apparent fearlessness. She manipulated the holographic controls, calling up more detailed footage of Shadowmaw encounters. Perhaps, Mr. Williams, you would like to see more specific examples of their hunting behavior? The display shifted to show a recovered recording from a merchant vessel's final moments. The Shadowmaw moved through space with terrifying grace, its tendrils extending impossible distances to wrap around fleeing ships. The audio captured the screams of crews. As they realized escape was impossible, Jake leaned forward, genuinely interested. Interesting. See how it's using those tendrils to predict flight paths? It's not just grabbing randomly. It's calculating vectors and intercepting based on probable escape routes. He pointed at the screen with his coffee cup. That suggests mathematical reasoning capability. This thing isn't just a mindless predator, it's actively problem-solving. Noxus's gaseous form contracted further. You observe tactics where we see only death. Well, yeah, because understanding the tactics is how you avoid the death part, Jake replied matter-of-factly. On Earth, we've got this thing called persistence hunting. Humans use to chase prey for hours, sometimes days, until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. We're not the fastest or strongest, but we don't give up. Ambassador Title's sonar clicking became more rapid. You speak of humans hunting as if you are predators yourselves. Jake paused with his coffee halfway to his lips. We are predators, persistence hunters, to be specific. Humans can run farther than almost any other animal on Earth. We evolved to chase things until they died of exhaustion. He gestured casually. That's why we have such good endurance and temperature regulation. We're basically the galaxy's most efficient pursuit predators. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Xylitha's crystalline form flickered with colors that indicated deep alarm. You hunt by chasing prey to death? Used to mostly. These days we have supermarkets. Jake grinned. But the instincts are still there. Humans are really good at not giving up. It's kind of our thing. Professor Kethera's scales had shifted to a pale color that suggested she was reconsidering everything she thought she knew about human biology. Mr. Williams, could you elaborate on these hunting instincts? Jake set down his coffee and pulled out his tablet, quickly calling up some videos from Earth. Sure. So, humans are what we call persistence hunters. We can't outrun a deer in a sprint, but we can keep jogging after it for hours while it has to stop to rest. Eventually, the deer collapses from heat exhaustion, and we just walk up and... He made a casual gesture. The holographic display now showed footage of human marathon runners, their faces determined and focused as they maintained steady paces for hours. To the assembled aliens, it looked like a horror movie. These humans just kept moving, never stopping, never giving up, their eyes fixed on some distant goal with terrifying single-mindedness. The really scary part, Jake continued cheerfully, is that humans can do this in almost any environment. Desert, jungle, Arctic tundra. We adapt our hunting strategies to local conditions. Some human cultures developed techniques for hunting whales in open ocean, others figured out how to track prey across frozen wastelands for weeks. Thessara's compound eyes reflected the growing horror of her hive mind. Your species hunted creatures larger than yourselves? Oh, absolutely. Woolly mammoths, cave bears, giant elk. If it moved and was made of meat, humans figured out how to hunt it. Jake pulled up more images. We developed tools to compensate for our physical limitations. Spears to extend our reach, bows to strike from distance, traps to multiply our effectiveness. The display showed human hunters working in coordinated groups, using complex strategies to bring down massive prey. The aliens watched in growing alarm as they saw humans outsmarting creatures that should have been far beyond their ability to challenge. But the real key, Jake said, warming to his subject, is that humans are social hunters. We work in teams, share information, develop strategies collectively. One human is dangerous. A group of humans coordinating their efforts. He shrugged. Well, there's not much on Earth that can stand against that. Ambassador Title's whale song had become a low, worried rumble. You speak of coordination, like the shadow maws tendrils working together. Exactly, except humans do it on a much larger scale. We can coordinate thousands of individuals across vast distances. Modern human military units can synchronize actions across entire star systems. Jake seemed completely oblivious to the terror he was inspiring. That's actually what made humans so successful. We learned to hunt as a species, not just as individuals. Professor Kethera was taking frantic notes on her display. Mr. Williams, you described capabilities that would classify humans as apex predators. How does your species coexist with other Earth creatures? Jake's expression grew more serious. That's actually a really good question. See, humans got so good at hunting that we almost wiped out everything else on the planet. About a century ago, we realized we were about to run out of other species entirely. The lecture hall fell silent again. The implications were staggering. This human was casually describing his species nearly committing genocide on a planetary scale. So, what did humans do? Noxus asked, their gaseous form barely visible with tension. We stopped, Jake said simply. Developed conservation programs, protected habitats, breeding programs for endangered species. We realized that a planet with only humans on it would be pretty boring. He pulled up images of Earth's nature preserves and wildlife sanctuaries. These days, humans spend a lot of effort protecting other species from us. Xylitha's crystalline structure was pulsing with rapid color changes. You voluntarily limited your own expansion? Yeah. Turns out that being able to destroy everything doesn't mean you should destroy everything. We learned that diversity makes ecosystems stronger, and strong ecosystems support more interesting life. Jake gestured around the room. Same principle applies to galactic civilization. Why would we want to eliminate all the cool alien species we could learn from instead? The assembled students exchanged glances filled with a mixture of relief and lingering terror. This human had just described his species as voluntary apex predators who had chosen restraint over domination. But Thesara's hive-mind voice carried a note of confusion. If humans are apex predators, why join the galactic community? Why not simply conquer it? Jake looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Because conquest is boring. You know what's interesting? Learning about energy-based life forms. He nodded toward Noxus, or hive-mind consciousness structures. He gestured at Thesera, or crystalline information processing. He smiled at Xylith. Why would we want to destroy all that fascinating diversity just to prove we could? Professor Kethera was beginning to understand something profound. Mr. Williams, are you suggesting that humans view other species as valuable rather than threatening? Of course. You guys are amazing. I mean, look at this university. We're sharing knowledge across species barriers, solving problems that no single race could handle alone. That's way more impressive than anything humans accomplish just by being good at hunting mammoth. Jake pulled up the Shadow Maw hologram again. Besides, creatures like this are what happens when you optimize purely for individual survival and predation. Powerful, sure, but ultimately limited. They can only destroy. Humans learned that cooperation creates more possibilities than domination. Ambassador Tidal surfaced completely in his tank. You speak of the Shadow Maw as if it were inferior to human capabilities. Jake considered this carefully. In terms of raw physical power, no, this thing would absolutely destroy any individual human. But humans don't fight as individuals. We fight as a collective intelligence with shared resources and coordinated strategies. He gestured at the tactical displays. This creature hunts alone, which means it's limited by what one mind can process and plan for. What do you mean? Professor Kethera asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. Well, look at its attack patterns. It relies on overwhelming individual targets through superior physical capabilities. But what happens when it encounters prey that can coordinate responses across multiple vessels? What happens when the prey can share sensor data, coordinate defensive positions, and implement adaptive strategies in real time? The implications of Jake's words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The assembled aliens were beginning to realize that they had been thinking about the Shadow Maw problem all wrong. They had seen it as an unstoppable force of nature, when they should have been seeing it as a strategic challenge to be solved. Mr. Williams, Professor Kethera said slowly, "Are you suggesting that coordinated human forces could actually engage a Shadow Maw successfully?" Jake scratched his head again. Engage? Maybe. But honestly, I'd rather figure out how to communicate with it first. Most predators can be reasoned with if you understand their motivations and needs. Even this guy probably just wants to survive and find adequate food sources. The lecture hall erupted in whispered conversations. Students who had arrived expecting to learn about an unstoppable cosmic horror were now discussing tactical solutions and diplomatic possibilities. Besides, Jake added, "Humans learned a long time ago that the most dangerous predators often make the best allies once you figure out how to work with them instead of against them. On Earth, we domesticated wolves, which gave us dogs. We partnered with horses for transportation. We even learned to work with dolphins for fishing. Noxus's form pulsed with something that might have been hope. You believe cooperation is possible with apex predators?" "I believe cooperation is usually more efficient than conflict," Jake replied. "It just requires understanding what everyone needs and finding ways to meet those needs without stepping on each other." As the lecture period drew to a close, the assembled students found themselves looking at both the Shadow Maw hologram and their human classmate with entirely new perspectives. The monster in the display no longer seemed like an unstoppable force of destruction. Under Jake's analysis, it had become a complex biological system with understandable behaviors and potentially manageable threat parameters. More importantly, they had gained a new appreciation for the humans sitting among them. Jake Williams wasn't just a friendly exchange student from a distant planet. He was a representative of a species that had evolved beyond the traditional predator-prey dynamic into something unprecedented in galactic history. That as students began filing out of the lecture hall, many approached Jake with questions about human survival techniques, cooperative strategies, and conservation methods. The human who had arrived late with messy hair and coffee stains had somehow become the most important voice in a discussion about the galaxy's greatest threat. Professor Kethera remained behind, updating her files with a new classification that would change xenobiological studies forever. Humans weren't just another spacefaring species. They were apex predators who had chosen to become apex protectors. And that choice, more than any display of strength or technology, would define humanity's role in the greater galactic community for generations to come. The truth about Earth's apex species the days following Professor Kethera's lecture saw unprecedented activity at the Galactic Academy. Word of Jake Williams' casual analysis of the Shadow Maw had spread through the university faster than quantum communications. Students who had been terrorized by the holographic display were now approaching the problem from entirely new angles, and many were seeking out the human for further discussions. Jake seemed bemused by all the attention. He continued arriving late to classes, spilling coffee, and offering insights that consistently challenged fundamental assumptions about predator behavior, survival strategies, and interspecies relations. What had started as academic curiosity was rapidly becoming something much more significant that Dr. Vorthak, the Academy's Dean of Strategic Studies, had called an emergency assembly. The massive auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and even representatives from various galactic governments who had traveled specifically to hear more about human capabilities and intentions. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation and underlying concern. Jake arrived 20 minutes late, carrying his usual coffee and what appeared to be a sandwich made from 3 different types of alien bread. He looked around at the packed auditorium with surprise. "Wow, is this some kind of special event? Did I miss another memo?" Dean Vorthak, an imposing figure whose species resembled crystalline trees, spoke in harmonics that resonated through the hall. "Mr. Williams, thank you for joining us. We've assembled this gathering to discuss some concerns that have arisen following your recent comments about human capabilities. Jake settled into a front-row seat, somehow managing to knock over a ceremonial plant display in the process. Oh, sure. What kind of concerns? Specifically, Dean Vorthak continued, questions about humanity's true nature and intentions within the galactic community. Your casual dismissal of the Shadow Maw threat has raised questions about human military capabilities and long-term goals. Jake looked genuinely confused. Dismissal? I didn't dismiss the threat. I just pointed out that most problems have solutions if you approach them systematically. He took a sip of coffee. Is that what this is about? People are worried because I suggested we could probably deal with a Shadow Maw if we had to. The murmur that ran through the assembly suggested that was exactly what this was about. Ambassador Keelix, representing the Outer Rim Defense Coalition, stood to address Jake directly. Mr. Williams, your species' casual confidence regarding apex predators suggests capabilities that far exceed our previous assessments. Many of our member worlds are concerned about human intentions. Intentions for what? Jake asked, looking around the auditorium with growing bewilderment. Conquest, Ambassador Keelix said bluntly. If humans can treat Shadow Maws as manageable problems, what does that suggest about your species' threat assessment of the rest of us? The auditorium fell silent as everyone waited for Jake's response. This was the question that had been lurking beneath every conversation since his casual analysis of the galaxy's most feared predator. Jake set down his coffee and stood up, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something more serious. You want to know about human intentions? Okay, let me tell you about human intentions. He pulled out his tablet and called up a holographic display. The auditorium gasped as images of Earth appeared. But these weren't the usual promotional materials showing human cities and technology. These were images of wilderness areas, nature preserves, and wildlife sanctuaries. This is Yellowstone National Park, Jake said, gesturing at. Under Jake's analysis, it had become a complex biological system with understandable behaviors and potentially manageable threat parameters. More importantly, they had gained a new appreciation for the humans sitting among them. Jake Williams wasn't just a friendly exchange student from a distant planet. He was a representative of a species that had evolved beyond the traditional predator-prey dynamic into something unprecedented in galactic history. That as students began filing out of the lecture hall, many approached Jake with questions about human survival techniques, cooperative strategies, and conservation methods. The human who had arrived late with messy hair and coffee stains had somehow become the most important voice in a discussion about the galaxy's greatest threat. Professor Kethera remained behind, updating her files with a new classification that would change xenobiological studies forever. Humans weren't just another spacefaring species. They were apex predators who had chosen to become apex protectors. And that choice, more than any display of strength or technology, would define humanity's role in the greater galactic community for generations to come. The truth about Earth's apex species the days following Professor Kethera's lecture saw unprecedented activity at the Galactic Academy. Word of Jake Williams' casual analysis of the Shadow Maw had spread through the university faster than quantum communications. Students who had been terrorized by the holographic display were now approaching the problem from entirely new angles, and many were seeking out the human for further discussions. Jake seemed bemused by all the attention. He continued arriving late to classes, spilling coffee, and offering insights that consistently challenged fundamental assumptions about predator behavior, survival strategies, and interspecies relations. What had started as academic curiosity was rapidly becoming something much more significant that Dr. Vorthak, the Academy's Dean of Strategic Studies, had called an emergency assembly. The massive auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and even representatives from various galactic governments who had traveled specifically to hear more about human capabilities and intentions. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation and underlying concern. Jake arrived 20 minutes late, carrying his usual coffee and what appeared to be a sandwich made from 3 different types of alien bread. He looked around at the packed auditorium with surprise. Wow, is this some kind of special event? Did I miss another memo? Dean Vorthak, an imposing figure whose species resembled crystalline trees, spoke in harmonics that resonated through it all. Mr. Williams, thank you for joining us. We've assembled this gathering to discuss some concerns that have arisen following your recent comments about human capabilities. Jake settled into a front row seat, somehow managing to knock over a ceremonial plant display in the process. Oh, sure. What kind of concerns? Specifically, Dean Vorthak continued, questions about humanity's true nature and intentions within the galactic community. Your casual dismissal of the Shadow Maw threat has raised questions about human military capabilities and long-term goals. Jake looked genuinely confused. Dismissal? I didn't dismiss the threat. I just pointed out that most problems have solutions if you approach them systematically. He took a sip of coffee. Is that what this is about? People are worried because I suggested we could probably deal with a Shadow Maw if we had to. The murmur that ran through the assembly suggested that was exactly what this was about. Ambassador Keelix, representing the Outer Rim Defense Coalition, stood to address Jake directly. Mr. Williams, your species' casual confidence regarding apex predators suggests capabilities that far exceed our previous assessments. Many of our member worlds are concerned about human intentions. Intentions for what? Jake asked, looking around the auditorium with growing bewilderment. Conquest, Ambassador Keelix said bluntly. If humans can treat Shadow Maws as manageable problems, what does that suggest about your species' threat assessment of the rest of us? The auditorium fell silent as everyone waited for Jake's response. This was the question that had been lurking beneath every conversation since his casual analysis of the galaxy's most feared predator. Jake set down his coffee and stood up, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something more serious. You want to know about human intentions? Okay, let me tell you about human intentions. He pulled out his tablet and called up a holographic display. The auditorium gasped as images of Earth appeared. But these weren't the usual promotional materials showing human cities and technology. These were images of wilderness areas, nature preserves, and wildlife sanctuaries. This is Yellowstone National Park, Jake said, gesturing at vast forests and pristine lakes. Humans created this preserve in 1872 to protect wildlife and natural ecosystems. This is one of over 400,000 protected areas on Earth, covering about 15% of our planet's land surface. The images showed wolves running free through forests, bears fishing in pristine streams, and massive herds of elk grazing in protected meadows. These animals exist because humans decided they should exist. We have the technology and capability to use every square inch of Earth for human development, but we chose not to. Ambassador Keelix's translator struggled with the concept. You voluntarily limit your own expansion to protect potential threats? They're not threats, Jake said simply. They're our neighbors. They're part of the ecosystem that makes Earth beautiful and interesting. More images flowed across the display. This is the African Wildlife Conservation Project. Humans spend billions of credits every year protecting lions, elephants, and rhinoceros. We've brought dozens of species back from the brink of extinction. The assembled aliens watched in amazement as they saw humans working alongside the very creatures they had once hunted to near extinction. Scientists tracking migration patterns, veterinarians treating injured animals, conservationists protecting habitats from human encroachment. But these are apex predators, observed Dr. Synthex, a cybernetic representative from the Machine Collective. Why would humans protect creatures that could pose threats to human safety? Jake's smile returned. Because a world without wolves isn't as interesting as a world with wolves. Because ecosystems work better when they have all their original components. Because diversity makes everything stronger, including humans. He called up more images, these showing the results of conservation efforts. Forests that had been restored to health, rivers running clean again, species populations recovering from near extinction. Humans learned something important about a century ago, Jake continued. We learned that being able to dominate everything doesn't mean you should dominate everything. True strength isn't about eliminating potential challenges. It's about creating systems where everyone can thrive. Thesara's hive mind voice carried collective confusion. But surely this philosophy doesn't extend to space exploration? Surely humans maintain military capabilities for expansion and conquest? Jake nodded. Oh, absolutely. Humans have extensive military capabilities, but we use them for protection, not conquest. The display shifted to show human peacekeeping forces. These are human defense corps units. They respond to piracy, protect trade routes, and provide humanitarian aid during natural disasters. The images showed human military vessels, but they weren't engaged in conquest. Instead, they were evacuating civilians from natural disasters, providing medical aid to plague-stricken worlds, and escorting merchant vessels through dangerous regions of space. You see, Jake explained, when you become the apex predator, you become responsible for everything else. It's not enough to just survive anymore. You have to make sure everything else can survive, too. Dean Vorthack's harmonic voice carried notes of wonder. You're describing a fundamental transformation from predator to protector. Exactly, Jake said. Humans figured out that cooperation produces better results than domination. Always. He gestured around the auditorium. Look at this university. Look at what we can accomplish when different species work together. Why would we want to destroy that? Ambassador Keelix was reviewing data on his personal display. But Mr. Williams' human military capabilities are substantial. Your species could theoretically challenge any existing power in the galaxy. Could we? Jake shrugged. Maybe. But why would we want to? Conquest is a dead-end strategy. You can only destroy things once, but you can learn from them for generations. He pulled up images of human scientists working alongside alien researchers, joint exploration missions discovering new worlds, and collaborative projects solving complex galactic problems. This is what humans do now, Jake said. We explore. We learn. We help. We've discovered that the universe is way more interesting when it's full of different species with different perspectives and different solutions to problems. Noxus's gaseous form pulsed thoughtfully. But what about the shadow maw problem? If humans have such capabilities, surely you could eliminate the threat? Jake considered this carefully. Eliminate? Probably. But should we? These creatures are part of the universe's ecosystem, too. Maybe instead of eliminating them, we should figure out what they need and find ways to provide it without conflict. The implications of this statement rippled through the assembly. This human was suggesting that even the galaxy's most feared predator deserved consideration and protection rather than elimination. Mr. Williams, Dean Vorthack said slowly, are you suggesting that humans would protect even the shadow maws? I'm suggesting that humans have learned to look for solutions that work for everyone, Jake replied. Maybe the shadow maws are only aggressive because they're starving. Maybe they attack ships because they mistake them for some kind of natural prey. Maybe they're actually intelligent and just need someone to figure out how to communicate with them. The auditorium buzzed with excited conversations as beings throughout the galaxy began to consider possibilities they had never imagined. Instead of the shadow maw being an unstoppable force of destruction, it might be a misunderstood creature that could be reasoned with or accommodated. Besides, Jake added, humans learn something important from our own evolution. The most dangerous predators often make the best allies once you figure out how to work with them. On Earth, we domesticated wolves and got dogs. We partnered with horses and revolutionized transportation. We learned to work with dolphins and improved our understanding of marine ecosystems. Ambassador Keelix leaned forward. You believe cooperation is possible with apex predators? I believe cooperation is usually more effective than conflict, Jake said. It just requires understanding what everyone needs and finding creative ways to meet those needs. The assembly continued for several more hours, with Jake fielding questions about human philosophy conservation efforts and approaches to interspecies cooperation. By the end, the mood in the auditorium had shifted dramatically. The fear and suspicion that had brought everyone together had been replaced by curiosity and hope that as the gathering dispersed, Many representatives approached Jake with offers of collaboration, research partnerships, and requests for human assistance with various galactic challenges. The human who had arrived late with coffee stains had somehow become the most sought-after diplomat in the galaxy. Professor Kethera approached Jake as he was packing his things. Mr. Williams, what you've shared today will fundamentally change how we approach xenobiology and interspecies relations. You've shown us that apex predator status doesn't necessarily correlate with aggressive intentions. Jake looked up from stuffing his tablet into his chaotic backpack. It's really just common sense, Professor. Strong creatures have the luxury of being gentle. When you're confident in your own survival, you can afford to be generous with others. But what about species that haven't reached that evolutionary understanding? She asked. What about civilizations that are still driven by conquest and domination? Jake's expression grew more thoughtful. Well, that's where the responsibility part comes in. When you become the apex species, you become responsible for managing the ecosystem. Sometimes that means protecting smaller species from larger predators. Sometimes it means teaching aggressive species that cooperation works better than conquest. And if they refuse to learn, Jake was quiet for a moment. Then you do what's necessary to protect everyone else. But you try education first, then economic pressure, then isolation. Violence is always the last resort, and even then, you use only as much as necessary to solve the problem. Professor Kethera made notes on her display. This philosophy explains human peacekeeping activities throughout the galaxy. You're not conquering, you're gardening. I like that, Jake grinned. Galactic gardening, making sure everything has what it needs to grow and flourish. Dean Vorthack approached, his crystalline form resonating with harmonics of deep respect. Mr. Williams, I want to formally apologize for the suspicion and fear that brought about today's assembly. We misjudged human intentions based on incomplete understanding of human nature. No worries, Jake said, somehow managing to knock over his coffee cup while shaking the Dean's extended appendage. Fear of predators is a pretty natural response. It's kept a lot of species alive throughout evolutionary history. But you've shown us that evolution doesn't have to stop at predation, Dean Vorthack observed. Species can evolve beyond their origins towards something more collaborative. Exactly. Humans just happened to figure that out before we expanded into space. Most species get one shot at becoming a galactic civilization. If you're still in your conquest phase when you achieve interstellar travel, Jake shrugged. Well, you usually end up eliminating yourself or everyone else pretty quickly. Ambassador Keelix had been listening to the conversation. So, humans achieved this philosophical evolution before space travel that suggests your species had time to work through the aggressive phases of civilization development. We had a few close calls, Jake admitted. Almost. Destroyed ourselves with nuclear weapons, almost collapsed our ecosystem with industrial pollution, almost wiped out most other species with overhunting and habitat destruction. But we learned from each mistake. What was the turning point? Asked Dr. Synthex. Jake thought for a moment. I think it was when we realized we were alone. For most of human history, we thought Earth was the center of everything, that humans were the only intelligent life in the universe. When we figured out how big space really was, how unlikely it was that we'd ever find other intelligent species, he paused. It made us value what we had, made us want to take better care of our planet and everything on it. And when you discovered you weren't alone, after all, Jake's face lit up. That was the best day in human history. Suddenly, we weren't alone anymore. Suddenly, there were new friends to meet, new things to learn, new problems to solve together. He gestured around the university. Why would we want to conquer all of this when we could participate in it instead? The conversation continued as they walked through the campus corridors. Other students and faculty joined the discussion, sharing their own perspectives on predator evolution, cooperative strategies, and the philosophical implications of apex species development. That by the time they reached the main plaza, a crowd had gathered around Jake. Beings from across the galaxy were asking questions about human conservation methods, conflict resolution techniques, and approaches to sustainable development. The human found himself at the center of an impromptu seminar on evolutionary philosophy and practical cooperation. The thing to remember, Jake said, addressing the growing crowd, is that being powerful doesn't make you important. Being helpful makes you important. Humans learned that we could use our capabilities to make the universe a better place for everyone, and that turned out to be way more satisfying than just being the strongest species around. Xylitha's crystalline form pulsed with curious colors. But what about the Shadow Maw problem? Now that we understand human capabilities, do you think your species would be willing to help address this threat? Jake considered the question seriously. I think humans would be very interested in studying the Shadow Maws and trying to understand them better. Maybe we could figure out what they really need and find ways to provide it without conflict. And if communication proves impossible, pressed Ambassador Keelix. Then we'd probably work with the galactic community to develop containment strategies that protect inhabited systems without unnecessarily harming the creatures, Jake replied. Humans have a lot of experience managing apex predators. We could probably figure something out. The crowd began discussing possibilities for joint research missions, communication attempts, and peaceful coexistence strategies. What had started as a fear-driven assembly about human threats had evolved into an excited planning session for solving one of the galaxy's greatest challenges. As the impromptu gathering finally began to break up, Professor Kethera approached Jake one final time. Mr. Williams, I need to ask you something that's been bothering me since your first lecture. Sure, Professor. What's up? When you first saw the Shadow Maw hologram, you weren't afraid. Not even a little bit. Most species have instinctive fear, responses to apex predators. Why didn't you? Jake thought about this for a moment. I guess because I recognized what it was. It's a predator, sure, but it's also just an animal trying to survive in a harsh environment. Once you understand that, it's not scary anymore. It's just a neighbor who happens to have really big claws, but surely you must have some survival instincts. Oh, absolutely, Jake grinned. But human survival instincts don't tell us to run away from dangerous things. They tell us to figure out how to deal with them. That's what made humans successful. We don't avoid problems, we solve them. Professor Kethera made a final note on her display. That may be the most important insight of all, Mr. Williams. Humans don't just survive challenges, you transform them into opportunities. As Jake finally headed off to his next class, already 15 minutes late, the campus buzzed with excited conversations about humanity's role in the galaxy. The species that had once been feared as potential conquerors were now understood to be the galaxy's most committed gardeners, protectors, and problem solvers. The demonstration had revealed Earth's true apex species, not through displays of dominance or aggression, but through acts of understanding, cooperation, and care. And in the end, that choice to be protectors rather than predators would define not just humanity's place in the galactic community, but the future of civilization itself. The story of Jake Williams and his casual analysis of the Shadow Maw would become legend throughout the galaxy, but not as a tale of human dominance. Instead, it would be remembered as the day the universe learned that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to create, protect, and nurture. The galaxy was safer, more diverse, and infinitely more hopeful, because one species had learned the most important lesson any apex predator could learn. With great power comes the opportunity to make everything better for everyone. In the end, they had called them apex predators, but the humans preferred to call themselves gardeners. And in a universe full of wonders waiting to be discovered and protected, that made all the difference.